From I Am Interchange, this is the Hatch podcast series.
It seems now more than ever that we have found ourselves on the cusp of monumental worldwide change. Whether we consider the environment, politics, infrastructure, health, economics, or inequities across a broad swath of social constructs, the consensus is clear and urgent. All is not as it should be. The United Nations, a consortium of 193 member states from around the globe, agrees. In 2015, the UN unanimously adopted the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. These goals call for urgent action in global partnership to secure peace and prosperity for people and the planet, now and into the future. In alignment with these goals, Hatch, a curated network of innovators, artists, activists, and entrepreneurs working together to accelerate positive global change, focuses the annual Summit Impact Labs on topics related to their 4 impact pillars: equity, education, environment, and empowerment. This series will explore those on the front lines of transformational systems change, accelerating solutions for these human challenges, uniting to hatch a better world for all.
I'm Tate Chamberlin, and in this podcast, I discuss the wealth gap and its impact on Black, Indigenous, and people of color, or BIPOC, communities, and national economic prosperity with esteemed lab guests Otho Kerr, Andre Perry, and Renay Loper. Otho Kerr, Director of Strategic Partnerships and Community Impact Investing at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, works to solve crucial environmental, social, and financial problems by advising investments in innovation and equity, moving money to makers. Senior Fellow at Brookings Metro, Andre Perry is the author of Know Your Price, Valuing Black Lives and Property in America's Black Cities, and the landmark 2018 Brookings Institution report, The Devaluation of Assets in Black Neighborhoods. He's a nationally renowned analyst of race, education, and inequality. Impact strategist Renay Loper is the Vice President of Program Innovation at Pyxera Global, an organization working to develop collaborative partnerships that put people at the center of public, private, and social interests to solve complex global challenges. This is I Am Interchange. We're up at the Hatch Summit, where there are 7 SDG labs that are up here going through accelerator systems change labs. And we've got Otho Kerr, we've got Andre Perry, and we've got Renay Loper. Is there a book that you'd recommend to anyone right now?
I would recommend Know Your Price, Valuing Black Lives and Property in America's Black Cities by esteemed author Andre Perry. It's available wherever fine books, very fine books are sold.
Know Your Price.
Know Your Price.
Yeah, my book, and I say recommended. I'm still reading it, but so far I'd say recommended. And it's How the Story is Told. Is it How the Story is Told or How the Story is Passed? By Clint Smith.
And I might say that given the nature of the work that we're doing at the Hatch, that I can only lift up the book written by my great friend Jacqueline Novogratz called Manifesto for a Moral Revolution, where she talks about how we go forward with morality and not only seeing the world as it is, but imagining and seeing the world as it could be.
I love that. Can you tell me a little bit about the projects that you're working on?
Yeah, I'm happy to go first. I will say that to the extent any of this appears as if I'm speaking on behalf of my employer, let it be known that these are only Otho Kerr's views and opinions today. But I work at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and my role as Director of Strategic Partnerships and Impact Investing is to drive capital towards solving problems and finding solutions to problems where we can drive capital to help fund those solutions in areas of climate adaptation and resilience, household financial well-being, health equity. Our mission at the bank is to make the economy work for all segments of society. And the big project that I'm really excited about that we're beginning to really tinker on right now is closing the digital divide in the 2nd District and beyond, and making the internet accessible to all members of our economy.
Thanks, Otho.
You know, I'll follow up a little bit. I'm Andre Perry. I'm a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, where I study Black majority cities. And in particular, I try to measure the value of assets in those cities, everything from housing to businesses to infrastructure. And like Otho, my goal is to create the kind of metrics that really show the potential that Black businesses, Black business owners, Black homeowners, potential homeowners have for the overall economy. Too often we hear a narrative that things emanating from Black neighborhoods, Black people are not as good, don't have the same level of quality, and therefore we shouldn't drive investment. But the research is clear that I'm doing is that there are assets that are very valuable, but many of the processes or practices and policies around them extract wealth and opportunity from those assets. And so I've developed what I call the Valuing Black Assets Initiative, VBI for short. And it comprises of several projects in which get to this point of trying to drive investment. One of those areas that I'm working on is we are looking at Black business development goals. We want to create environments in which the business community can rally behind specific goals to scale up businesses in metro areas. Just to give some data on this, Black people represent about 14% of the U.S. population, but only 2% of employer firms in the United States. And I bring that up because if the percentage of Black businesses match the percentage of the Black population, we would see 800,000 more businesses added to this economy, trillions of dollars created because of that. And so for me, I want people to see the potential, the economic potential of investing in Black businesses. In general, I study the underappreciated assets, meaning if you just add water, it will grow. And so for me, it's where Otho's work and my work really dovetail nicely is that, my goal is ultimately to drive investment. And it's to compel leaders in government-related enterprises and government at local, state, federal level, as well as among business leaders, to compel them, hey, here are the businesses, here are the homes, here are the communities that will not only yield return, and I always bring this up, they will provide or create a social conditions that are really conducive for growth overall. There's just too many ways, nefarious ways to grow an economy. We've become very comfortable having growth out of exclusive or out of exclusivity instead of inclusivity. And so my goal is to say, hey, I want growth just like everybody else. But we have a moral obligation, in my mind, to get the kind of growth that is inclusive, because if we don't, we're essentially exploiting and oppressing people. So that's what I'm working on. Thanks a lot for having me.
Hey, Renay.
Hey. Renay Loper here. And like Otho, while I work for an organization called Pyxera Global, what I will share and speak about are reflective of my own opinion and experiences. But I will share a little bit about Pyxera Global. So we sit at the intersection of public, private, social sectors, really bringing the best of each, the resources of each together to solve problems, to do cool stuff and solve problems that affect us all. We got our roots. We got our start in traditional development, so traditional international development, which is a truly flawed system, a flawed approach. And traditional development is all around doing something to someone. I have the answer, let me give you the answer. I have the resources, let me solve your problem and give you the resources, let me save you. And so what we do from Pyxera Global standpoint is flip development on its head and have more truly inclusive and equitable approach to, it's still a development space or development framework, but it's collaborative development. It's doing things with people through partnership and centering their expertise, their resources, their perspectives, and bringing that to the table with the other resources. So no resource is greater than the other, but with the other resources to solve problems, all with the focus towards sustained communities, sustained livelihoods, and just all around positive and progressive health and well-being. And so a lot of our work is issue agnostic. So we do work with education, in health, in agriculture, in technology. So the issues are different, but the people are the same. So it's all about centering people and putting people at the center of the problem and the solution. And so that's what we bring to the table. We work most largely or most closely with corporations, so Fortune 100 corporations, bringing them to the table. They invite us to their table, and so we bring communities with us to the table, but bringing to the table the community perspective, the community voice, and those who are most often impacted by, again, solutions, technologies, approaches, but are often left out of the conversation and the equation. And so we bring that to the table. And so two projects that I'm working most closely on is unpacking the role of the private sector, unpacking the role of corporations in dismantling structural racism. What does that look like? What is their responsibility? How have they been complicit in perpetuating it? And what do we do with it now? And then another related but different project is working on inclusive circular cities. Sustainability is kind of the next thing. Just a ton of focus and attention on sustainability. So what does it mean for a space to be sustainable? What does it mean for a city to be sustainable? What is the role of circularity in a city? What is the role of inclusion in a circular city? So really working on unpacking that.
Can I just offer up an observation after that? And since our audience can't see us, I will just offer an observation that all three of us are Black. And what I'm really excited about in having conversation with them is that the work that Andre is doing, the work that Renay is doing, is work that's so incredibly important for the change that we want to bring about at the Fed. To the extent Andre is this guru who understands data and how to apply data to help us understand how to make the changes that are necessary to create equity. And Renay's lifting up the voices of communities that are often unheard. And to us, we know that in order to drive capital, we really need to step in, understanding what the capital needs from the perspective of what the community needs from the perspective of the community. And we all too often don't have the voices of the community, the leaders or the members of the community at the table. And we go in and presumptuously make these investments in solutions that are not necessarily in service of that community. So what Renay is doing is so incredibly important, as is what Andre is doing, and it's really helping us do the work we do.
Is it okay if I piggyback on that? I remember in grad school when we first learned regression analysis, and it's really just a fancy way to compare different variables. And one of the things you have to do in a regression analysis, you need a reference group to compare other groups. And the way I learned it was to always put a white male in that as that reference. So you're always comparing Black people, brown people, Asian folk to white males. And mathematically, you want the largest group as the reference group from a mathematical standpoint. It just makes a better model. But the issue here is that it sets up this weird psychological sort of frame that we start seeing white men as the standard. And it almost, and you see this in research, to suggest that in order for there to be justice, Black people, brown people, whoever have to catch up to white people in order for there to be justice. So what Renay is talking about in terms of a research project about when it comes about learning how to center the people, whoever proximate to these problems that we talk about, in research, we need to do that as well. We need to put Black, brown, Asian folk at the center of our analyses, because too often we do what the development world does every day, is that they put somebody else's idea of what this community should be in the center. And I'll just give why this is very important, because in planning, you'll hear this, or urban planning, you'll hear this term placemaking, right? Which doesn't make any sense. You don't make they already exist, right? But it's a concept that says, hey, a planner, an architect, or whatever, it's really about their vision for a place, not what the community's vision may be. And so I think Renay's point is so important in that we must center other people in our work. And I need, as somebody who works at Brookings, a think tank, I also need to do that in my research, because a lot of folks read our research, and if we're constantly saying, hey, this is what black people and brown people need to do to catch up to white people, we're sending the wrong message. We're not addressing the mechanisms that actually prevent people from actualizing their potential.
So like the separation that you made was between city planning and architects, and what placemaking communities that are already there, there's a disconnect between those two spaces. There's a difference between maybe the cultural development of it.
I'll just say there can be. That if you don't have a profound sort of interest in saying, hey, let me listen to the groups that are proximate to this problem. Say it's housing devaluation, something I studied, meaning sort of the deliberate suppression of housing prices. If you don't seek solutions from people who are actually in those areas, you will miss solutions. I mean, people all the time try to get answers from the muckety mucks of the world, like from people like me. And my privilege blinds me to many different problems. And I'm a black person, and I'm from the hood. I had a background of poverty, but positionality matters. And so where you sit, it will blind you to a lot of the things that we see. So the way to counter that is to make sure you get information from the people who are dealing with these issues.
So Andre, you said something, and if you don't mind, Tate, I wanted to come back to and ask you a question. When you talk about in the data, oftentimes the white man is the standard. So what happens when we change the standard?
One, we definitely need to change the standard. And I'll give you some like concrete examples, and a housing example, no pun intended. Well, the pun was intended, concrete. Well, in housing, appraisers use a price comparison model in determining value of a home. Now, there are many ways to establish values. And let me just back up a bit. All value is socially constructed. So there are values of people that are baked into the valuations that we give, and we might put numbers on them, but those numbers reflect our personal beliefs, our personal expectations. And so when it comes to valuing homes, we use this price comparison model, where you compare a home to another in a neighborhood. The problem with that standard of assessing value is that if you only compare homes within a neighborhood that's been discriminated against, you recycle the discrimination over and over again. So what I've been recommending is that we change the standard, widen the aperture, so you don't just look at homes within a neighborhood, that you look at homes in other neighborhoods with comparable social circumstances. We have the data to essentially create twins, say a home in a black neighborhood and a home in a white neighborhood, similar social circumstances, same home structurally. We can do that across a metro to really get at the intrinsic value of the structure of the home. And so if we change that standard, we can then identify a sort of, you say a median value. So in this area, homes better be in general around this ballpark. If an appraiser comes in and it's well below, we either got to send in another appraiser or something needs to happen. So for me, I see standards that we could replace tomorrow, and we could have a positive impact. But I don't want to go back too much into history, but I would just want to remind listeners that when you're talking about single-family zoning, when you're talking about appraisal practices, using the price comparison model, these are all practices that are vestiges of a segregated past. And they were explicitly used to keep black people out. But because of the passage of the Fair Housing Act, a lot of these practices still are in place, and we act as if that some changes of the law will affect change. No, we got to actually go after these practices and policies that are the standards.
Right. It's the foundation.
That determines so much of our life. So we should change these standards. I mean, we need to change many of these standards that reproduce inequality every single day.
Actually, if I might jump on that and also lift up, and again, this is only these views are mine, but the Fed focuses on maximizing employment, and the Fed looks at unemployment numbers. And everybody always hears about a target unemployment number, or what is optimal unemployment. And oftentimes we hear 3% or 4% being a really nice, strong economy. But what I love about what I hear from the Fed is that that's not the standard. They look at that, but they look at the underlying data as well. And they look at what's going on in the BIPOC communities, what's going on in black communities, indigenous communities, Latinx communities, to understand whether or not the economy is as strong as it thinks, or the rest of us thinks it is, because of that one number. That one number is not enough anymore. We have to look at all of the numbers and not use that as the standard.
And, when you're talking about the Fed, coming up, I had this, perception of the Fed as some kind of moralless, valueless institution that just sets interest rates. And it's filled with robots that say, oh, this happened in unemployment, therefore we must react with this interest rate change. And the more I got to know people in the Fed, you see that they have goals, dreams, values that they want to see happen. That these institutions are not lifeless beings. They're made up of people. And if you have people in them that want to do the right thing, I mean, we are in finance, fiscal organizations where you see a lot of numbers put up. But the reality is money represents value, the value of people that we impose. And so for me, when I look at a changing Fed that is now really more so than ever before addressing this issue of the racial wealth gap, where we see white median family wealth, 170,000 using 2016 numbers, compared to 17,000 black median family income. So it's 10 times greater. So when we see that kind of wealth differential, the Fed actually can play a significant part, because interest rates that's money. I mean, and it's capital access. And also, when you're talking about maximizing employment, you really have to ask about for whom, in what context. And those are things before I never really knew of Fed Reserve. They will act.
Listen, I was thinking, what is it, Geppetto, the puppet? I was thinking the Fed was the soulless, but I could not agree with Andre more around people are at the center of everything, whether we want to acknowledge it or not. Organizations don't collaborate, entities don't collaborate, companies don't collaborate. It is the people who create the policy, the people who create the programs, the people who are affected by things. So in my perspective, when you bring the people into the room and you center the people, that's where the magic can happen, because you're tapping into something. But I think it all starts with personal people-to-people exchange and interaction for everything.
It goes without saying, I'm sitting with some incredible people right now. And I also say this, when I first met Otho, immediately I saw and met someone, a person I was talking about. I was like, this person's at the Fed. And he shares the same goals and values I do. I don't want this to get all mushy, but
Let's do it.
But it's like we need to make these connections. I hadn't know in the past, and I'm a learned, economically mobile individual. Again, I'm from the hood, but I'm college educated. I never met somebody who worked in the Fed. When Otho talks about full employment and optimal employment and things like that, I didn't really know what those things meant. It's really somebody had to tell me, somebody I met. And with Renay, it's like, I love hearing what she's doing. And my first thing is, how can we work and build and connect? Because I have some skills that I can deploy, but I actually need people and their ideas to work with. I don't do anything without centering someone. So I just think that this is an example of what can happen at a much larger scale, getting to know the people of these institutions that really have, what I call like this architecture of inequality, the structure. I mean, we work in institutions that are influential on our everyday lives. So if we can talk and if we can build, we can really change the racial wealth gap in this country.
Well, Andre, you're just so important to this conversation. And I will just say for the record, and I told you this a few days ago, but when I told my team at the Fed that I was going to be in conversation with you, they said, why do they need you if Andre is there? That's all they need. He's making the difference.
But the reality is, we absolutely, as researchers, we don't exist in a vacuum. That I actually need to talk to someone, and most often researchers just don't talk to Black people. So we have to define a problem, and oftentimes if that problem is not properly defined, because we have not centered the right people. And so for me, I think getting to know Renay and Otho, and hearing their values. Again, you hear me talk about values all the time. I may talk about numbers, but I really am talking about values. So when you have people who say and mean and live out inclusion, I can work with that. I know that I can then define the problem and create the kind of analysis I need. But if I'm going to talk to the muckety-mucks, the power people who have a vested interest in maintaining status quo, I'm going to get the same kind of solutions we've always seen.
Yeah, one word that just came up is this concept of inclusion. One of the things that gets me excited is this notion of an inclusive economy. And I think there's been a wonderful sea change, and we're seeing this reflected in institutions like the bank. And hopefully we'll see this reflected more in corporate America. And we've seen that. The Business Roundtable, Milton Friedman came out in 1970 famously saying that corporations were meant to maximize shareholder returns, profitability. And we saw that gain traction. And we saw the consequences of that. Unfortunately, in the 80s and 90s, it gained traction. The Business Roundtable in 1997 codified the maximization of shareholder profit. And we saw the consequences of that, where corporations just began to forsake their employees and the environment and other important stakeholders in pursuit of profitability. But we saw pushback. We saw that in the form of the Tea Party movement. We saw that in the form of Occupy Wall Street. So on the right and left, we saw people saying that the economy wasn't working for them. They were feeling left out. They were feeling as if they were being used. They saw other people becoming really, really wealthy as they were falling further and further behind. And as a result, we've seen this pushback by those movements. We've seen populism rise as a result of that. But we've seen folks across the political spectrum say that the economy actually does have to work. Practically speaking, it has to work for more people, presumably for everyone. Morally, it should work that way. But practically, it's unsustainable when it becomes fully extractive. And we saw the Business Roundtable, fortunately, turn about a few years ago, and they said that the economy should be one that works for all Americans. And so in service of that, we're seeing more and more players, corporate players, government players, civil society leaders lean into that notion of inclusive capitalism and figure out how all segments of society can participate. Now, I just said inclusive capitalism, and I'm not even making a plug for capitalism. I just think an inclusive economy, whatever it is going to be a stronger one, a more sustainable one. It's important from, again, practical perspective and a moral perspective.
I'll say, Otho, to that, I got excited when you talked about the pushback, because to me, again, I go back to who's often not included, who's often not part of the conversation, and it's the people who are driving the movement, who are feeling it, and I feel like that gives me a glimmer of hope that things will be different. Is there's so many movements that are happening that are literally shifting our world right in front of our eyes. We're participating in them, we're witnessing them, but there's a shift. I always say the tectonic plates are shifting. There's a shift that is happening right in front of our eyes. I'm grateful to the BRT for responding, for listening, because I go back to the power of business. I do think that business has a responsibility, but business is also culture shapers. I think that business and their infinite resources are culture shapers, and I'm grateful to see them taking the responsibility to shift the culture, not to make it political. But I got excited when I think about, some of the voter suppression that's happening, or that has happened and continuing to happen in the state of Georgia. And when I see Ken Frazier and the other Black CEO stepping up and saying, no, we need to do something about this. There's Black and brown voices that are being suppressed for exercising their right to vote, attempting to exercise their right to vote. In my lifetime, I have not seen CEOs step up and step out in that way, and then Black CEOs step up and step out in that way. That's the kind of thing that I also get excited about, and I would expect to see more C-suite leaders step up and do that, because again, you're bringing your peers along with you, and you're shaping the narrative. You're shaping realities for people.
And just as an idea, because I know we should assume that not everyone knows all the things that we're talking about. The Business Roundtable is a membership organization comprised of some of the most successful Fortune 100 companies in America. And they recently released a statement basically obligating them money and resources to a series of racial justice initiatives.
What are some of the most interesting ideas that you're grappling with right now?
Racial inequality is a big thing. But I think we're all trying our best to exercise the many different programs and initiatives that we mentioned in the beginning. Those are the things that I think each of us are really working on. And we are very cognizant of the larger issues that are at play in this country. And we have to do our best to keep our eye on that. But I think for a lot of our struggles, we're trying to execute this work. Because if we can execute some of the goals that we've all set for ourselves, and if we can cross-pollinate at time and learn from one another, I think we can achieve some things. So for me, I grapple with these larger issues, but right now I'm just very focused and passionate about the work at hand for me.
Andre, yesterday we had a conversation about the reparative culture, and reparations is not something that I've taken on and spent a whole lot of time thinking about how it might be executed. When I think of reparations, and you helped me reframe it, because I thought of reparations writ large, like national reparations, and you helped me rethink it and think about handling it in bite-sized pieces, if you will, by having a reparative culture and seeing what different communities deploy. I was excited to have this conversation with Renay, because to the extent a reparative culture is one that we want to follow through on, it's going to require listening to different voices, because they're going to look at it differently, have different needs, different wants, think of fairness and justice in different ways. And I thought you might help us explain what you mean by reparative culture and what you've seen out there, what the struggles are, and what the opportunity is.
Yeah, reparations is a big word, but in the main, it's essentially redress for an injury caused by government or some other larger entity. And there are several injuries that have been caused since the founding of the United States, one of which most people are very familiar with, or should be, maybe not as knowledgeable about, but slavery was a horrific act that forced people into labor, that did not pay them, prevented intergenerational wealth transfer, created a stigma that persists to this day of being less than and not as smart and not as motivated. And so most people, when they think of reparations, they do go point to slavery. And a classic definition, the definition of slavery is an act of Congress or the act of the nation state to offer redress for some type of cause or harm. But it also includes acknowledgement of the act and for the injured to accept the apology, if you will. So it's not just about money. But when it comes to reparations and slavery, I mean, most people agree that they're reparations for slavery, for lost wages, essentially. That's reparations. But there's been other injuries that African Americans, black people, can lay claim for or have claims for, and that's in housing discrimination. A lot of people are becoming more familiar with the federally backed Homeowners Loan Corporation, which drew red lines around predominantly black neighborhoods, deeming them hazardous or unworthy of investment. And that act alone, that one practice, prevented wealth transfer for generations. That $170,000 median wealth that white families have, that just didn't occur because of bootstrapping. That occurred because they did not get redlined. And they were able to collect assets and pass them on to children. So that's an injury. In very recent weeks, months, there's been a number of cities that have attempted to get reparations for housing discrimination. Now, I did pen the federally backed Homeowners Loan Corporation, but when it comes to housing, it's also a state and municipal issue. And so many municipalities discriminated against black people and did the redlining and carried out some of these actions. And so not theoretically, a person can lay claim to discrimination by the city. And many cities are recognizing that they owe some form of reparations. Evanston's trying it to a certain extent. Asheville's trying some reparations. And some people are arguing, Sandy Darity, one Washington Post editorial back and forth with Sandy Darity on this issue. Some people will not accept local reparations as reparations, that it's not a congressional act. I love it because, for me, it's showing that all across the country, at a local level, that people are recognizing that a harm was done and they're willing to do something about it. That's a cultural phenomenon.
It reminds me of patchwork, where like in activism and LGBTQ activism, when the government doesn't have your back, the communities that can do something will do something.
Yeah, but this is really grassroots efforts to demand reparations, and they're getting a hearing from local municipalities. Now, to me, that points to a cultural shift. You know, redlining didn't come from the federal government. It came from Baltimore City and other cities, and it worked its way up to the federal government. I say all the time that reparations won't come from D.C., it will go to D.C. And yes, and these programs have issues. The Evanston program is not a well-constructed program, I'll just put it that way. And it has problems with it. The things they're doing in Asheville, they have problems with it. So all these places are really testing us. I really do believe that the more you see this, the more it reflects a change in culture, the more we're learning from cities. So cities are learning from each other. And then eventually you'll see Congress respond with a robust reparations program. So that was a long-winded, but I have
a question.
Yeah, go
for it. So did I hear you correctly when I thought I heard you say that not all reparations are made in financial form?
It really depends on the injury. You can create a scholarship program, for instance, so where you don't necessarily get a cash payment, but you get a scholarship. And so that's when so there are things, but I would think depending on the injury, you can always come up with a dollar amount, attach a dollar amount to that claim. Right,
that's what I was thinking, and I was always under the understanding that reparations were always in financial form or having a dollar amount. So I thought I was learning something new.
And no. But this is the argument.
Yeah,
there's some folks who make the term reparations it's a proprietary,
Broad, yeah.
like concrete definition, and you can't wiggle out of that. I still look at reparations as a general term and recognize that when there are actions that fit that definition. I don't know what else that is, but when you see a city government saying, we're going to provide down payment assistance for those people who were redlined, who we redlined.
That's
what
a
else?
form of right.
That's a form of reparation.
Yeah.
It may not be big R reparations.
Yeah.
And so that's why I'm like, we need to acknowledge
Yeah.
and encourage that activity, because we're seeing a reparative culture.
There's something really liberating about that, too, for those of us who think of reparations, right? Because, again, it becomes digestible as opposed to overwhelming.
Yeah.
And that's a really wonderful reframing for me. I'm wondering, having Renay sitting beside you, Andre, I'm wondering, we know governments are playing a role. It's critical. Have you seen business play a role, corporations at all, in the reparative culture?
They need to. Listen up.
do.
Listen up, because remember, it's not just governments that did this.
Right.
Corporations, churches.
Right.
It's like there can be claims made easily to these things. So, and this is what I will say, while I support the really substantive change in the business community to actually acknowledge that racism exists, they also need to acknowledge that they were perpetuating captains of industry.
Yeah. So to that point, what would it look like? So what would you instruct or request or suggest a corporation to do tangibly that would?
It depends on the claim.
Yeah.
If you were the company, the hospital that experimented on black people, there is a medical claim you can make. I mean, and so it's always based on what happened. I just believe that across the board, when you have a reparative culture, you will have corporations admitting, you know what?
That's the first step.
We did not provide our black workforce this wage for decades simply because they were black. Here's what we have to do. And so that's the kind of culture I think that is taking place in the country. I mean, but corporations' acknowledgement that racism exists in general is an improvement. The next step is for them to recognize the racism within their own institutions. And that's going to be challenging.
And Andre, this is a wonderful learning experience for me while on a podcast.
I know, me too.
I'm scribbling notes, and hopefully the listeners are taking notes as well. But if we wanted to go to a resource that could help us think about this a bit more, what are the resources out there, if any, to help us think about reparative solutions and ideas?
I will say that right now, Sandy Darity and Kirsten Mullen has a book out on reparations. I'm blanking on the title, but those are the authors. I would read that because he really lays out the moral and economic argument for reparations. There's an article co-authored by yours truly, Andre Perry, on why we need reparations. So if you get that article by Andre Perry, Rashawn Ray of the Brookings Institution, great. It's one of the most widely read pieces on reparations. I would start with those ones, an article, and the other's a book. So depending on your available time. But those are some good resources. But I would say this, 20 years ago, the percentage of Americans that supported reparations was 13%. Now it is 30%. So more and more people are not only knowing about reparations, they're believing in it. So people are thirsting for these resources.
I bet you the number would go even higher if the term was reparative culture, right?
Yeah.
And if you give the hospital example, 90%, well, maybe not 90%, but so many more people would appreciate that concept.
And it is, reparations has baggage with it. And this is where you get a big debates on this. People want to hear reparations, and they want to see a congressional act. And so some people say, don't ever change the language. Don't change. And some people are like, get people to see that when the federal government gave PPP, Paycheck Protection Program, because we didn't bring this pandemic upon ourselves, the federal government recognized businesses were hurting, they created a program. That's a form of reparations. Mm-hmm. I mean, and if people can just understand that this is just doing what we do all the time, except mm-hmm. for not for Black people, mm-hmm. and except not for slavery and Jim Crow racism and housing and discrimination during the New Deal. We can get this. Some people are so proprietary. I don't know if that's the right word, but they just want the word to be in the forefront. And I'm more of the ilk. This is where I'm biased. I just want to cut the check. Mm-hmm. Like, what mm-hmm. will cut the check mm-hmm. at the end of the day? Mm-hmm. And so I'm much more flexible.
I've got a speed round. Dictator for a day or democracy to create solutions as urgently as we need?
You know what? It depends on who the dictator is. I think it could be great dictator for the day. I see how things get done, and I sometimes think democracy gets in the way, and it can be muddy. We see what happens in California where there's extreme democracy, and it can just get really muddy and dirty and ineffective. If I were the dictator, I'd be happy to be dictator for the day.
You got me when you said to create solutions. When you just left it at dictator versus democracy. Right. I'd say democracy, but for the solution part for a day, dictator.
What about legislative versus social change?
You need both.
I need both, but I believe in social change. I think legislative issues follow social change. So when you get social change, then you get the legislation.
What brings you hope?
Working with doers like the people at this table.
Young people give me hope because that's what we're doing it for. That's what I'm doing it for. And they expect nothing less than something better than what we currently have and what I had and what our ancestors had. So that's what gives me hope.
And all I can say is ditto to what Renay said. And it's not because of our responsibility necessarily, but spending time with young people, they just think in a different way. They think about taking care of this earth. They think about humanity in a different way. There's an openness and a love for their fellow being and the earth that wasn't there when I was a young person. Mm-hmm. So it's the young people that give me a certain amount of hope and energy.
I love just opening this up to the three of you. That was a lot of fun for me. And it's an intimidating mindset to be around.
Thanks for having us, and we'll see you soon.
Yeah, thanks, Renay and Andre. Thanks, Tate.
Thank you both. Thank you, Tate.
The answer to questions of social, political, and economic restructuring to equitably serve us all is resoundingly, unquestionably clear. Invite the community to the table and listen. It's not enough to pull token representatives, to hire consultants, to hold focus groups. As Loper iterates, people are at the center of everything, whether we want to acknowledge it or not. Real human experience is the fulcrum on which all societal restructuring tips and pivots. We can do much with research and advocacy, but important change and transition to reparative culture is made only when the oppressed and disenfranchised, the maligned and misrepresented, are given a platform, an audience. Through their respective work, from within and without the financial sector, Kerr, Loper, and Perry are unpacking the role of investors in dismantling structural racism, bridging the wealth gap, and forging a new paradigm moving forward that is less dependent on privilege and positionality, and finally, defined by the people. A shout out to our media and production team, Jessica Byerly, Allison Gregory, Kevin Hilton, Roy Chapman, Eli Kisko, Raymond Onsatagi, Sean Mackinson, Robert Edwards, and Mark Groner. A special thanks to Yarrow Craner, Jared Silverman, Pete Strom, Josie Caton, Eitan Shapira, Cassidy Seckman, Bryant Stersala, Rachel Hicks, Katie Yam, and Lou Morris. A special thank you to Hatch supporters, Steelcase, the Kauffman Foundation, the Gideon Fund, Envision Equality, the Hatch Volunteers, Board of Directors, Hatch Guardians, and the community who help make this work and mission possible. To learn more about Hatch, visit thehatchexperience.org. Building community could not happen without food. And with that, I'd like to thank Whistle Pig Korean, Red Tractor Pizza, and Zocalo Coffee House. Do you have an issue that's riddled by gridlock in your community? Shoot me an email at tate@iaminterchange.org. That's tate@iaminterchange.org. Remember, share airtime and don't ruin dinner.